and welcome back. If you're sitting here watching this, it's probably because you watched me make this pair of bloomers here last week, and you're possibly interested in constructing a pair for yourself, but you're interested in some of the nittier, grittier details of how I handled some of the details of this project. Fair warning then, this week's video will be a little bit slower than last week's because I want to make sure that you can follow along. But I will do my best to keep it as interesting as possible and moving along. Without further ado, let's jump right in to the biggest hiccup of this project, the welt pockets. Now this is perhaps not the best way, nor the most efficient way to attach these pockets, but it is literally the only way that I could figure out how to attach these pockets and still guarantee that the pocket bag lined up with the top of the waistband and the side of the pant leg. So this is my personal process that I ended up settling on, and I am sure that there are several different other ways to do this. There's probably even a better, more efficient way to do it. But this is the path that I found after having tried a few different other techniques on the first welt pocket, learning from those experiences, and then transferring that information to my second welt pocket. You are under absolutely no obligation to follow the same process that I did. And if you think of a better process for this, please let me know. I would love to learn for the future if there are other ways to tackle this pocket that guarantee the same alignment of the pocket bag with the rest of the garment. So a quick note here, I did not interface my wool fabric behind where the welt pocket is going to go. This is a common practice when inserting welt pockets, but I found that my wool fabric was already getting quite thick with all of the layers that are required for a welt pocket, and the fabric was fairly sturdy with a tight weave. But if you have a thinner, flimsier fabric, I highly recommend putting a strip of interfacing on the fabric behind where the welt pocket is going to go. And that would look like this. That should do it for the intro. Let's jump right into the actual process.
I figured someone here would probably appreciate this. I guarantee if I don't do this on both pieces, the right and left side, that I will end up sewing one of these pockets in the wrong direction inevitably, and then I will be left with two right sides or two left sides. 10 out of 10 would recommend this technique if you are as harebrained as I am.
Okay, so looking at the outside of the pant, this is the right side of the pant that will be facing outwards. I have marked my welt, so the middle slit here is where I will actually be cutting eventually for the pocket, and then I have marked out 1 centimeter on either side of that. This will make my final welt 2 centimeters tall. If this is the middle line, then this is the bottom line, and I'm going to take my welt, which is this piece right here. You can see I have interfaced it for some stability, and I'm going to line this black line up with the bottom line on my welt. This black line is also a 1 centimeter seam allowance. So we're just going to pin that down. I like to line up my first pin and my last pin with the edges here of the welt so that I don't sew too far by accident. Once I've got that pinned down, I'm going to go and carefully sew exactly on this black line. So just fiddling around with this, making sure to be very precise about where I am starting this seam line here. So I've got my needle just in front of this. I'm going to be sewing all the way down to the other end. Okay, so I have sewn along this line up to and stopping at the ends of the welts, and now is when most people would actually sew on a separate patch up here, but that is actually not what I'm going to do because I don't like the bulk that that gives. I actually did try it out. You can see it here in this clip from last week's video, hiding in the corner, but it just ended up being too thick. So instead I'm going to be using a combination of twill tape and top stitching to eliminate a bit of bulk. So for me, the next step I'm going to do is I'm going to be cutting along this middle line here, which is going to be the opening for the pocket, making sure not to catch the welt here when I cut. And we're just going to be cutting along the middle line and then on either edge of this sort of Y that is formed here. We've gotten it cut, And you can see here it forms a sort of double-edged Y, that cut. This is the flat, and the key here is really making sure
that you make this cut here all the way up to as close to that stitching line as possible without cutting through the actual stitches. Next, we are going to pull the welt through to the inside of the pant leg. This may seem a bit confusing, but I tried to make it as clear as possible, so just follow along the best that you can.
We've turned the welt to the inside. This is the outside of the pants. Got my iron heating up. And we're just going to fold these under like this and iron them so that from the outside, these three sides will be pressed, and this side will not be pressed yet. That will be pressed next, but first, these three sides. So I've just flipped it over. You can see we are now on the inside of the pair of pants, and the raw edges of the welt pocket are now exposed. So what we're going to do is now take a piece of twill tape and just cover that raw edge. Very hard to do one-handed. So we're going to cover it and we're going to pin it down. The goal is to get the twill tape pretty close to that edge there, so that in the corners there's nothing that's able to unravel. And also you want to make sure that you're covering this raw edge, so depending on how wide your twill tape is, you might have to actually trim this down a little bit.
You can see here I trimmed mine down so that my rather thin twill tape was able to completely cover the raw edges.
Here we go, it is all pinned down. We are still on the inside. I actually extended this tape past the welt a bit. Is it crucial? No, but I don't think it's gonna hurt. And you may be thinking that I'm using an excessive number of pins, but that is because I like to pin from the back side, but sew from the front side, since it's going to be top stitching that is visible. I prefer that this tape is not shifting around unbeknownst to me while I sew it. The heads are all facing out so that I can easily pull them out as I sew. Now we're just going to go and very carefully top stitch these three sides. And now we're going to do the part where we actually make the welt. I'm going to turn this over. We're back on the inside, and we're just going to press this nice and open so that it'll lay flat once we fold this over. If you don't press this, then you risk getting a kind of wibbly welt once you do the next step, so don't skip this step. Okay, she's all pressed and flat, and now we're going to turn her back over to the outside for the next step. And we want to make sure that everything is laying super flat. So actually what you could do is you could give this whole thing another press, just like this, to make sure that it is all lying flat, because the next step we're going to fold this welt over just to make sure everything is lying super flat for this next step.
Once that's quite flat, I take and mark the edge with my chalk pencil, making sure the line transfers through to the welt layer below. I now have my fold line marked and can simply iron it down on that marking point. Once that's done, I then like to fold it back right away and check and make sure that everything looks good before moving on. If something doesn't line up, I remark it and repress it. But Shannon, you say, I don't have a chalk pencil to mark my lines. Not a problem, I got you covered. Stick around to the end of the video and I will show you an alternative method for handling this part of the welt pocket problem.
Okay, so now is the moment when we will be needing to use our pockets. So there are two pocket pieces supplied, and one they call a facing, and one is just a normal pocket bag. And so we will be using the pocket bag. You can cut two of those out, and then I am not actually using the facing piece, because instead of facing the pocket, I'm actually lining the entire front half of the pants. I will not be using this pattern piece except for the placement, because it is actually impossible to place this pattern piece without first using this pattern piece, and I will show you what I mean by that in a second. This is the larger pattern piece labeled facing, and for this leg we actually need to use it this way, but just so that you know, this is the larger bag, and this one is meant to line up exactly with the edge of the pant and the top of the waistband. So you're going to line it up there, and then from there we can lay. This is our smaller pattern piece, and we're just going to be able to line that up on top as you can match. It lays right over. And now we can see, okay, so this is where the pocket bag is supposed to go, but without this larger piece, which butts up on the edge of our pant, it's a little bit of a mystery where this one is supposed to go. So definitely using the larger piece, lining it up, and then you can actually just trace the larger piece starting from about here. Go ahead and chalk line that, or mark it however you prefer. And that is where the outside of your pocket is going to get lined up. So go ahead and let's mark this, and then we can move on to the next step. I think I can get rid of this now. Okay, so now that we've gotten this marked down and our pocket lined up with it, we're just gonna go ahead and throw couple pins in here to make sure that it doesn't shift around, because now we need to pin the pocket bag to the welt pocket underneath. Here I folded the raw edge of the pocket bag under so that roughly a centimeter of the welt is showing, and I'm pinning that down, trying only to catch the uppermost layer of the welt. Here's what that looks like once it's all done, and as you can see I accidentally passed through both welt layers with a couple of my pins, so I'm just going back and repinning those, making sure to only catch that first layer. And now you can see everything is correctly pinned down, and I can completely open up that welt. This means I can go ahead and sew the pocket bag down, again sewing only through the first layer of that welt. Once it's all sewn down, it should look like this from the back, and like this from the front. And now I'm just going to add the last bit of top stitching around the outside of this welt pocket. So now I'm just going to pin my lining layer down to my wool outer layer, lining up the edges and notches and such. Now because my lining layer is a contrasting color and I didn't want it to be too visible when the pockets were worn, I decided to add a little piece of the green wool to the lining layer right at the pocket opening. In order to know exactly where to place that camouflage patch, I marked where the pocket opening was by inserting a few pins into the lining layer only, then used those as a guide for placing the patch. After quickly double checking its placement, the patch was then sewn down to the lining layer. Now I lined all the layers up, making sure they were all smooth and laying flat before using a few pins to secure the lining layer to the pocket bag. You don't need a zillion pins, just enough to keep the two layers together for the next step. If you're worried about this edge fraying, you could serge it, or you could turn it under twice and narrow hem it, but since this will be caught between the fashion fabric and the lining layer, I've left mine raw. As I will be sewing these two layers together with the pocket bag facing up, I need to do the majority of my pinning on this side, so now I'm just going around and pinning the edges of the pocket down to the lining. Here's what that looks like, and you can see how I've handled the corners. I will be sewing all the way up until this last pin, and then picking up again over here at this pin. So now that that is all sewn down, this pocket is officially done. Here's what it looks like from the inside, and here's the outside view. One beautifully, if perhaps somewhat inefficiently, executed welt pocket, done and done.
So what other tricks do I have up my sleeve for these bloomers? Well, the first is a simple trick to make your corners look cleaner. Because the front and back of these bloomers attach with buttons, there are a lot more corners than on a modern pair of pants, and that facing can make it hard to turn them all inside out cleanly. So here is my trick for that. When I'm approaching a corner, I usually like to change my stitch length to be much smaller than normal. However, I sewed these on a really cheap sewing machine that doesn't have great control over stitch length, so instead I carefully reverse stitched over all the corners. This allowed me to trim my fabric quite close to the stitch line without worrying about eventual fraying of the fabric. The next tip is one I use when gathering fabric. I personally hate the gathering process. I find it tedious and fiddly, and I always end up with uneven stitches. So to combat that, I use a lot of marking. In this project, it's the leg we'll be gathering into the cuff, so I'll be marking both the cuff and the pant leg with the halfway mark as well as the quarter marks. Once everything is marked, I then fasten my gathering thread at the beginning of the pant leg. Then use the cuff and a Sharpie to mark exactly how long that thread needs to be in order to be the correct length to match the cuff. In this case, the cuff was 40 centimeters around, but rather than using a ruler, I simply use the cuff itself to mark out the halfway and end points on the thread. Next, when I attach the cuff, I decide where I want the seam of the cuff to be. I thought it might be less visible if it was on the inside. I can then use my marks that I made earlier to line up the 4/4 of the soon-to-be gathered pant leg with the cuff. This helps to ensure that my gathers will be relatively evenly spaced. I even take this one step further by quickly tying off that gathering thread at the halfway point by wrapping it around a needle. This is, in fact, completely overkill, and I don't actually recommend that you do it. The last tip that I have for you is one that I already touched on in my main video, and it's about the placement of the button. I don't like to rely blindly on where the pattern pieces tell me to put the buttons, so instead I mark where the pattern says they should go with chalk or with a little thread tack, and I do go ahead and sew on that first button on one side, but I then put the pants on me and mark where the first button on the other side should go. I compare this to the mark on the pattern, and if they line up closely, I go ahead and sew all the other buttons according to the pattern marks, occasionally trying the pants on every second or third button just to make sure that things continue to fit. However, if I notice that my marks differ significantly from the marks on the pattern, I do in fact try the pants on after each individual button, marking as I go to make sure that the pants fit properly. That is actually one of the great features about these pants. Having the buttons on the side allows for a little extra adjustability if perhaps you've sewn your pattern incorrectly, if it didn't fit properly, or maybe you didn't use the correct seam allowances. Also, a word for the wise. As we learned last week, it is important to mark the correct side of your buttonhole when marking these buttons. So, in this case, you should be marking the edge of the buttonhole that extends the furthest onto the other piece of the pant. If you perhaps don't drink enough coffee before you start sewing, you might end up marking the wrong side of the buttonhole, and then you're gonna end up with a button that looks a bit like this. Fortunately, this is an easy problem to fix, but I think it's best if you don't do like me and just mark them all correctly to begin with. So for those of you who don't have chalk pencils that make really precise lines, here's another technique for correctly marking the size of that welt. We'll be taking it from the point in this process where 3 sides of your pocket are top stitched down. Make sure you still press your welt open as in the previous method.
We're just going to shimmy this welt out to exactly where it needs to be. So this is going to take a little bit of finessing, and you just want to pull this welt out so that it's exactly showing in the corners here, nice and flush. And then I measure at a couple points midway along the welt to make sure that it's nice and square with the opening of this pocket. But the most important is to get the 2 corners down, and then once you have the 2 corners down, you can kind of adjust the middle.
Alright guys, that's it for this project and this week's video. If you made it this far, thanks for sticking around, and be sure to check back next week for more creative content. I hope you have a great weekend, and until next week, bye!